Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Restrung podcast. I'm your host, Sander Vika, your friendly, extremely average club player turned podcaster. And today we're going to talk about the Australian Open and preview all the things that may await us over the next fortnight or so. And I gotta say, this always tends to be perhaps my favorite tournament, my favorite, not just Grand Slam, but my favorite tournament of the year. And it probably has a lot to do with the fact that it's the first real major tournament, big tournament of the year. But not just that, it symbolizes the start of where players historically tend to make runs. It's the place where Novak Djokovic started his incredible run in 2011. It's the place where Stan Wawrinka really burst onto the scene to become the occasional giant killer and Djokovic slayer that he ultimately became for a few years. It also has been where we've seen emergence of stars like Yannick Sinner on the biggest stages. That, coupled with just how far away it is, the heat, the uncertainty, the late nights that are so distinctly not New York, always has and will throw up surprises. So that's certainly what I'm looking forward to. There's obviously a number of storylines as well that headline this year. The biggest one, of course, is can Yannick Sinner become the first male player to three-peat since Novak Djokovic, only the second player to do that in over 25 years. When you think of the likes of Roger Federer and Andre Agassi and others that have excelled on this court, then that just understates what an achievement that would be. Then, of course, there's all the questions surrounding Carlos Alcaraz. Historically, not someone who's done particularly well at this tournament. Never really had particularly great success so far here in his career, even though his last two Australian Opens were cut short by two of the better players on tour. And obviously, when you lose to Novak Djokovic in Australia, that is still nothing to be ashamed about. But what can Carlos do? It's really the big title that still has eluded him, other than the year-end finals, if you will. But also, it will give us an insight into Alcaraz post Juan Carlos Ferrero. And what does that mean? And what does that look like? So very interesting from that perspective as well. And then, of course, you can never go into an Australian Open without talking about Novak Djokovic. He's won the tournament a record 10 times, and quite often Australia has been such a linchpin for him to really set him up for the rest of this season. And we've obviously seen over the last kind of 2 years where the rise of Sinner certainly and the continued rise of Carlos Alcaraz have really frustrated him, because ultimately the idea that he can take them and beat them over 5 sets becomes a more daunting task year on year. But obviously a fool would discount Djokovic in his most successful tournament and perhaps his favorite tournament as well. And beyond that, there's a bunch of other storylines that have us excited. Too many, obviously, to cover in just a fairly short preview podcast, but spare a thought for one of this tournament's more successful players in the past 15 years, and that in Stan Wawrinka, the exiting giant killer, winner of the 2014 Australian Open, where he went through Djokovic and Nadal, something very few players can ever say in any tournament, let alone over 5 sets. And what can he do? Obviously has nothing to lose, knows this is going to be his last Australian Open, and is really in a position where he can leave everything out on the table. So very interesting to see what will happen there. He starts his campaign off against Laslo Djere, and then likely against Yuri Lehechka. And if that were to be a successful test for him, then potentially against Taylor Fritz. So a very long and daunting road for Stan Wawrinka, but we hope that he can enjoy his Australian Open and really give the fans something to think about. And looking down the barrel, as it were, of the draw, some interesting rounds, some interesting matches in some of the earlier rounds. One that we've highlighted, of course, is Matteo Berrettini against hometown favorite Alex de Minaur. Now, whether Matteo Berrettini's firepower can stand the test over potentially 5 sets against what has to be the best poised Alex de Minaur coming into this tournament for a very long time, perhaps ever, is sure to send off some fireworks. Carlos Alcaraz isn't going to have it all his own way, as he has an always potentially dangerous pair of Americans to get through in the round of 32 and the round of 16 with potentially Seb Korda and Tommy Paul before a potential matchup with none other than Alex de Minaur, the hometown favorite. For Yannick Sinner, it seems to be a little bit more straightforward. He potentially, though, has quite an interesting matchup, which would be very well watched and attended in the round of 32 with João Fonseca, the rising star who really has made a name for himself last year at this tournament with massive forehands that really got some of the Brazilian crowds and South American crowds going in some of the smaller courts. But really, it's not until the quarterfinals when he potentially comes up against Ben Shelton or Casper Ruud where things get really quite interesting for him. And if we look at the path which 10-time champion Novak Djokovic has, although an ever dangerous Botic van de Sandschulp could be on the cards in the round of 32, and his conqueror in Miami of last year, Jakub Mensik, in the round of 16, it's really not until the quarterfinals where a potential date with Lorenzo Musetti, Grigor Dimitrov, Stefanos Tsitsipas, or even Taylor Fritz makes things a bit more difficult for him. Obviously, he and Yannick Sinner in the same half of the bracket, meaning again that he would need to go through potentially the best hardcore player in the world to set up a ultimate date in the final with potentially Carlos Alcaraz, the world number one. We talked about this tournament always being an interesting one to spring up surprises. A couple of wild cards we've identified for ones to watch. Alexander Bublik, who beat Lorenzo Musetti only about a week ago to win the title and played some incredible tennis. He could very well, with some equally good play, find himself in the quarterfinals, potentially against Carlos Alcaraz. Would, of course, have to go through Alex de Minaur in all likelihood in the round of 16. Another wild card to keep an eye on, of course, is, and weird saying this as he's number 3 in the world, is Alexander Zverev, who really, if he can keep his head, should be able to quite smoothly get through to the quarterfinals, where a potential matchup with either Felix Auger-Aliassime or Dani Medvedev would be on the cards. Now, of course, obviously the other person to look out for and under those names is Dani Medvedev, who looks to surge back to the top after seemingly starting to find a bit more form towards the end of last year and winning his first tournament of the year in Brisbane. So those are just a few names to look out for and few matchups to look out for at the Australian Open. The Australian Open kicks off in Anger on the 18th of January, so this Sunday, and it's sure to be a great one. We'll have some updates throughout, followed by a more in-depth review show. But for now, we hope you enjoy the Australian Open as we will, and we'll see you again real soon.